back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have a special guest, Marcin Krzyzanowski, who is a former Polish diplomat, a businessman, member of Poland's Geopolitical Society, and expert on issues such as Afghanistan and Iran. And we'll be discussing with him an issue that has a broad interest but has so far sparked very narrow discussions, which is of course the issue of the geopolitical shift in the MENA region and of course the developments in Afghanistan. So far we have been focused on a very US and China-centric view of these developments, but it would be interesting to see how Eastern Europe and Poland are impacted by the normalization with Iran and Syria, and of course China's and Russia's growing roles in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get into this nitty-gritty of the geopolitical strategy, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in all these issues?
I was a student of Iranian studies. I graduated myself at Jagiellonian University in Krakow in the field of Middle Eastern studies. Later on, I spent a few years in Afghanistan as a Polish consul and deputy head of the mission of the Polish embassy in Kabul. Later, after I left the ministry, I became a private entrepreneur and worked in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran for a couple of years. And later on, I started again academic career as a lecturer of the Jagiellonian University, and currently I'm also a PhD student and independent researcher. And my main topics are issues connected to the Middle Eastern economy, especially Iran, security situation, and social changes in the Middle East, with focus on Iran and Afghanistan.
So it's very interesting because we don't often hear from people who've done business in these countries. We hear a lot from geopolitical analysts, from politicians, and from the military personnel, but not so much from the microeconomic perspective. What was it like working there in those countries?
It was hard, as the business culture there is different than business culture in Western countries, including Europe. But after the first few hard months, it was very nice, although still a hard job, and it gave me a very interesting perspective and additional input to my research, as I more familiar with the mechanism, this economical mechanism of the Middle East than most of analysts and experts.
I'll get straight to the point with my next question, which is how do you deal with what appears to be a significant amount of corruption in the business culture there?
It's the main part of those differences I've mentioned. Unfortunately, the corruption and nepotism is a real plague in the Middle Eastern economies, and Iranian economy is no exception. Of course, with Iran, the additional problem are international sanctions against Iran, but that's another topic.
So how do you get around these issues when you're faced with incredible amount of graft, with nepotism, with entrenched issues? How is it possible to succeed in such an environment?
It is very hard, but it's always take a long time to success, and sometimes, of course, failure is also an option. But with a good background as mine, because before I started doing business in the Middle East. I spent a few years there as first as a student and as a diplomat. So I was able to avoid much of the let's say much of the risks and problems connected to the specific conditions of doing business in Middle East. But unfortunately, sometimes I was forced to abandon a promising project because I was unable to cope and to deal with corruption, or I couldn't face the nepotism present in that area.
I find it interesting because Iran, in particular, very much likes to differentiate itself from tribal societies, particularly Arab societies, by being a different sort of society. And yet, despite all of that, the nepotism there is just as strong, although it may manifest itself a little bit differently. But the issues are um, very much similar, which brings us to the point, which is the shifting climate in the Middle East. Despite all these difficulties, despite the sanctions, despite um, a sort of Cold War that's going on between the US and some of the European countries and Iran and its some of the states and proxies that are aligned with it, uh, it it's been doing pretty well, especially in terms of energy. And despite its differences, cultural and business differences with China, their business has also been growing, and this has been ongoing before the latest wave of China brokered deals and normalization. So I'm curious whether that kind of growing business and financial economic relationship, how has it contributed to China's political leverage and ability to broker those deals?
And China is seen as by many Middle Eastern countries, especially Iran, as a counterbalance to United States, and China is seen as a power horse able to get out from the United States scope. Most of of Middle Eastern countries in the last few years are trying to emancipate a little bit, trying to be more independent in the field of policymaking and economy. And as I said, China is widely seen as counterbalance for the United States, especially by Iran. China was able to help Iran to survive the United States maximum pressure campaign, as China remained the last big buyer of sanctioned oil of Iran. And by that, China helped Iranian economy to survive its wars crisis in 2019 and 2020. And by that is seen by Iranians as chance to strive even more. At the moment, after the war in Ukraine started, Russia also joined that counterbalancing club, and especially for China, the current circumstances are very favorable. There is a lot of tensions the scope of the United States shifted from the Middle East first to Pacific region, at the moment more to Europe. So China is trying to step into not the empty space, because the United States didn't left the Middle East, but China is trying to put more pressure on the situation and to gain momentum in the region.
Now, one of the issues that has not been sufficiently highlighted, in my opinion, in the media coverage of these events is China's general opposition to all major sanctions on any subject matter whatsoever and with anyone anywhere. Even counterterrorism sanctions on radical groups, China generally opposes. So that makes for a very curious situation where, on the one hand, China is this political power broker that is being seen by some of the, let's just say, less democratic countries in particular as a kind of as a way to circumvent sanctions and certainly circumvent any pressure on the rule of law, accountability, democracy, human rights, or anything else. On the other hand, China is expected to play the role of a security intermediary and guarantor of security, for instance, with the recent deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are not particularly close politically, to put it mildly. How can those things work out for China, given its anti-sanctions position and given the fact that it seems to be unwilling to intervene with the proxies, with the Iranian proxies or any other non-state actors that play into the security equation?
First of all, sanctions, especially complicated sanction campaigns as the maximum pressure campaign toward Iran, has to be tight. If the sanction system is not tight, if it is not hermetic, it means that there is only a slight chance of success. Thanks to China, as I said before, Iranian economy avoided a total collapse. It ended only with crisis. For the China, it's a chance to be a power counterbalancing power broker in the region. For example, in the case of Iran, China was widely seen as a helper, and thanks to the sanctions, it's worth to say, China was able to buy a lot of this cheap, maybe not cheap, but discounted oil from Iran, which is a huge advantage for Chinese economy. And by dealing with various proxies in the area, Chinese are able to establish a vast network of informal contact, political and economical. And in case of necessary, they are able to use their influence over politicians. Chinese footsteps are getting more and more visible in the Middle East, although Chinese policy is very nuanced and balanced. China wants to do business, China wants to influence the region, but without being engaged in ongoing conflicts. The best example of that were the relations between China and Iran and Saudi Arabia. Each step toward Iran needed to be balanced by a similar step toward Saudi Arabia. If one day Saudi foreign minister paid a visit in Riyadh, soon later such visit should be repeated in Tehran. And another good example of increasing Chinese influence is a deal, an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by Beijing and signed in Beijing. For China, such agreement is another chance to gain additional influence and additional profits, as conflict is not good for business, especially between two main powers of the region. China was able to lower tensions a little bit. With lowering tensions, more investment is possible in one or another country.
But given Iran's long-term religious agenda in the region, which is in direct conflict with Saudi Arabia, how can China protect its own investments from eventual disruptions?
It is very hard, not to say impossible, although let's say real life and business and money usually prevails over values. And Iranian influence in the region is, as you indicated, mostly based on the religion agenda. But Iran is able to tone down its own religious propaganda and be focused on doing business with former opponents. So we could witness a major shift in Iranian and Saudi Arabian media coverages of current relations. It was very sudden, very sudden shift in the tone. Yesterday, just before signing the agreement, Iranian news, Iranian medias were full of anti-Saudi Saudi materials. Based on policy, based on propaganda, based on religious ideology, and of course the same was from the side of Saudi Arabia. But after signing the agreement, as I said, tone was shifted. It was it was a sharp turn. And at the moment, the very same newspapers are full of articles full of materials praising Saudi Arabia and Iran, respectively, and the former hostility is nothing. It's null and void. There is no even mention about that. And as long as the deal, as the tent between Riyadh and Tehran is fruitful for both sides, the religious part of the former, let's call it former conflict, will be put into the closet.
Well, many of us forget that the relations between Saudi and Iran have been diplomatically normal up until 2016, even with an attempted assassination against the Saudi ambassador Al-Jubair at the time in the United States. That didn't sever the relations, and nothing, and they kept on going up until the Saudi embassy was attacked in Tehran. Now, you just made a very good point, which is that economic, pragmatic considerations beneficial to both sides create the pragmatic need to restrain extremist rhetoric and geopolitical antagonism. What happened in 2016 that broke that balance? What pushed Iran to attack Saudi Arabia at the time? And why are they seeking or are willing to engage in rapprochement now? What is their long-term goal, given that even when they had diplomatic relations with Saudis, they kept engaging in behavior that would naturally be disruptive to such relationship.
Yeah, that time, I mean, 2016 was a peak of Saudi Arabia, or to be more precise, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, assertive or aggressive policy in the region. He was trying to counter Iranian influence in Iraq, in Syria and Yemen. Saudi Arabia was kind of surrounded by Iranian influence, Iranian proxies, so tried to strike back. That's the part of countering Iranian activities was to control Saudi Arabia Shia population, which was heavily influenced by Iranians. So the tensions was very high that time, and that drop which overfilled the bowl was execution of Shia clergymen in Saudi Arabia. That sparked protests and demonstration in Iran, especially in Tehran. And after crowds stormed the embassy, the case was closed as the embassy itself. And but after a few years of tension, few years of let's say Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia, both countries figured out that it is impossible to defeat another one, and that ongoing conflict is harmful for the economy. Iran is facing a long-term structural economical crisis. Saudi Arabia, especially Crown Prince MBS, wants to focus more on internal affairs, as the Saudi 2030 Saudi Vision reform program. Fighting crisis and being focused on the Saudi Vision is impossible, literally impossible in the situation of conflict with such powerful enemy as Saudi Arabia and Iran are to each other. So both sides decided to put hostilities aside and focus on making money.
Well, given the fact that Iran's proxies have not actually gone anywhere and Saudi Arabia is still surrounded by them, would it be fair to say that Iran may be getting the better of the deal? At the very least, it can say it has won in the sense it hasn't had to sacrifice those proxies and that regional control while still making money.
That's true. The rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and it's a new chapter in the relations with Saudis doesn't mean that Iranian proxies will simply disappear. They are still in place. The Iranian influence is well established in Syria, is undeniable in Iraq, and quite strong in Yemen. Although after the reapproachment, Iran is scaling down its activities, especially in Yemen. There's a possibility that soon serious peace negotiations will start, and Iran decide, as a part of agreement decide to lower its activities against Saudi Arabia. At the moment, especially with the let's say fiasco of Abraham records, at the moment there is no really deep problem between between Riyadh and Tehran. The most important issue was Yemen and Iranian influence over Shia population in Saudi Arabia. With agreement signed and with ongoing normalization, Iran will just restrain itself from anti-Saudi activities for a while. But as you said, the agreement is, to be honest, a victory for Iran, because it is kind of confirmation of Iranian influence in the region, and a kind of confirmation of Iranian very strong position as the regional power.
In fact, I would even go a step further and say that given that Iran up until recently has denied its weaponization of various groups in the region, the Houthis and so forth, and claimed that they're not really dependent on Iran, I would say it can equally claim to have no control over them if they continue to attack Saudi Arabia, and basically say that they have distanced themselves and have bear no accountability for what happens next. The sheer amount of weapons floating in the region, including in Yemen by now, may suffice for continuing attacks even with Iran's any further contributions.
That's true. First, we need to say that Iran is not in full control over the proxies. For example, Houthi rebels in Yemen are fully independent. You have to remember that the war in Yemen started, the general conflict in Yemen started way before the current conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It predates it, and Iranian influence over it is limited. Iran was able to add something to that conflict. Iran was able to encourage Houthis. Iran was able to make them stronger. But Iran is not able to simply end the war, even in the case of full backdrop from Yemen. But at the moment, Iran can influence its allies, its proxies, and pressure them to sit with Saudis in a negotiation table. And except for that, we are also witnessing rapprochement between Saudis, or more general Gulf countries, with another Iranian ally, Bashar al-Assad from Syria. And once again, this is a confirmation that Assad won the war. Assad long time was treated as a pariah by other Arab countries, but at the moment rapprochement is in its full swing, and most probably soon the hostility between Syria and Arab countries will end, and it will be another sign of Iranian influence in the region, and it will be a confirmation that Iran is able to be maybe not kingmaker, but for sure power broker in the region.
And then that brings us to another point, which is the third member of this triumvirate: China, Iran, and also Russia. Russia was losing steam for a while thanks to its military misadventure in Ukraine. It had to relocate its forces out of Syria. It had to relocate S-300s out of Syria. All of a sudden, we are seeing Russia making deals between Saudi Arabia and Assad, between Turkey and Assad, bringing various parties to Moscow for re-engagement, and sort of reasserting itself diplomatically after becoming essentially a pariah state in the Western world. In the Middle East, it's regaining legitimacy as a country that is able to bring together these relationships despite being militarily weak. How is that possible? How can Russia play that role given that it's essentially humiliated itself internationally in terms of military power? Military power is something that the Middle Eastern states very much respect. They also like money, but from that perspective, China would seem to be a more natural player than Russia, which has just been losing ground exponentially. So how do you explain this development?
Well, a weaker player is still a player. Russia is losing the war in Ukraine, but it's still a very important political and economical player in the Middle East, and which is most important. For long years, Russia was widely recognized as an opposition to United States and so-called United States imperialism. And many Middle Eastern politicians, many Middle Eastern citizens are seeing Russia as another counterbalance, another player in the game for world domination. And as United States are perceived by many countries in the Middle East as a kind of imperialist power or post-colonial power, Russia is seen as a chance to oppose United States. Many of countries which are supporting Russia are not supporting Russia because they love of Russia, but their hate against the United States. So it's not about supporting Russia; it's about playing against United States.
Say it's a very interesting situation where Russia, as a significantly weaker political, military, and economic power, I'm not counting the oligarchs and their individual ill-begotten resources, I'm talking about the actual economy. Nevertheless, is playing outsized influence in a significant part of the world, in part due to natural resources, but and in part due to the fact that the US has given up refinement of a lot of these raw materials, but also in part to its ability to kind of play off these rivalries and take advantage of the situation. And normally, a weak military power would be isolated. It would be looked at with contempt. But Russia is able to navigate everyone's haters of other players to its own advantage. Quite interesting. But what's interesting to me is I'd like to kind of get back a little bit to Europe from here. And what Russia's bringing together of Turkey and Syria means for the ongoing efforts in Ukraine. Because up until this point, Turkey was playing kind of a double role. It negotiated the grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, but at the same time, it was holding up nominations to NATO of Finland and Sweden and causing and buying Russian weapons and accepting Russian currencies and dealing with helping Russia overcome sanctions. And now but the one major thing that was still kind of keeping it on the West, on NATO's radar, was the fact that it was blocking Russian Navy and causing it the problem of transferring more weapons and fighters to Syria. And of course, from the Syrian perspective, Turkey, was a troublemaker. It was essentially occupying and influencing parts of the country, and these tensions kind of put limitations on both countries. Now they're about to normalize, or at least starting discussions towards that. How can that impact what happens next? Western forces in Syria that are supposed to keep some relative balance from various extremists, from Hezbollah, from Assad's forces, uh, ISIS efforts, and so forth, oil, protecting oil. Then we have this blockade of Russian Navy. If all these players normalize completely, what happens with these developments?
That's very important and interesting question. And the Turkey plays very important role in the NATO and NATO policy. But although Turkey is a member of NATO, it also has its own agenda. President Erdogan policy is based on the old, almost Ottoman resentment, and Turkey wanted to carve out as much of Syrian pie as possible. However, it was impossible to topple down Bashar al-Assad regime, thanks to Syrian and thanks to Iranian and Russian support given to him. So the Turkish influence was limited by Iranians and by the Russians, and by negotiating with both of those countries, Turkey wanted to implement its own agenda. They are nothing strange. Turkey, as I said, has its own interest and trying to pursue them. And sometimes, unfortunately, Turkish interest is against the whole NATO interest, as we can witness now. For us, I mean, for the Eastern Europe is especially problematic, as the Turkey is geopolitically significant from us. It is the gate from and into Europe or Middle East. Depends on the side we are traveling. It is important transportation hub. It is important hub of natural gas and oil. And Turkey is crucial from the perspective of drug smuggling and possible illegal migration, as the Turkish road is still the most popular among migrants. And the relations between Turkey and European countries, I'm not talking about NATO dimension, but the European Union dimension now. The relations between the European Union and Turkey are a little bit strained. They're good, but there is a lot of, let's say, misconceptions about the Turkish role in Europe. And without Turkey goodwill, the Ukrainian ports would be totally useless. Fortunately, Turkey is still playing in one team with us.
What happens if that changes? Or what happens, let's say, if Turkey gains sufficient leverage from these relationships to start turning start using it to extract, let's say, concessions of various types, or if those concessions become unacceptable, to essentially blackmail through this port situation, the way it has in the past blocked EU through the migration crisis.
Oh, for sure, Turkey, after getting upper hand, Turkey will use it as a leverage in its negotiation with United States and with European Union. Turkey is too important to be omitted, and we can't simply sanction Turkey or do something like that. So the very delicate approach towards Turkey is necessary, as Turkey is, as I said, too powerful and too important to be omitted. But we have to also remember that Turkey is not a monolith. Soon we will witness major elections in Turkey. So the electoral campaign is hitting up the issues as illegal migration and Turkey presence in Syria, and of course also the Kurdish question, which is vital for the Turkish policy.
Now, there is another aspect of it, which is, as you mentioned in the past, Turkey and Iran and Turkey and Russia have had their share of differences, but it has started to change. For instance, circumvention of sanctions has brought all three powers together, and most recently, Iran and Russia have been cooperating on joint weapons production, on sale of drones, missiles, things of that nature. And Iranian drones are being used by Russia in Ukraine. Can they also end up elsewhere? So far, we know that Ukraine has been using Turkish drones, but imagine the situation changing, Iran and Turkey growing closer. So far, we have not seen any hostility between Turkey and Iran over that issue, the use of competing drones in the region. What do you see for in the future, and can some of those drones end up being used elsewhere?
Iranian drones are getting quite famous in the world, especially among the so-called developing countries. They've proven to be cheap and reliable, and they are quite effective with low cost. But I don't think that there is a chance for cooperation on that field between Turkey and Iran. It will be more like a political, geopolitical, and economical competition, as Turkish drones also proven to be very effective and more sophisticated and expensive, and beyond the reach of most countries, especially in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. Iranian drones are much, generally speaking, of course, are much cheaper, and Iranians are willing to sell them with no restrictions. And Turkey is, let's say, limited by its NATO membership and agreements between Turkey and the United States. Iran has no such obligation, so it is. So Iranian drones are free to buy by anyone able to pay for them. And as Iran is strongly needed money to fight the ongoing crisis of its economy, for sure will be interesting in doing deals with new clients, new buyers, and it poses a danger for the regional stability. Such drones sold to African countries will hit up local conflicts there.
One of the issues that I've been hearing some rumors about is Serbia's potential interest in Iranian drones. So far, the tensions in the Balkans have been managed. They haven't gotten to the point of extreme escalation. But if drones and missiles and weapons of that nature enter the picture, that may change. What happens if another conflict erupts, and how could that affect the war in Ukraine and surrounding areas?
Well, a new conflict will be first of all will be a distraction. Conflict in Ukraine is very expensive in the matter of money and equipment, not to mention the cost of human life, of course. And if Europe and if NATO and especially United States will be forced to engage in and engage a little bit more in a different place, it means that less equipment, less ammunition, less money, less aid will be delivered to Ukrainian forces, which subsequently will affect the battlefield in Ukraine. So, from our perspective and Ukrainian perspective, the peace in other places is most desirable situation. Although, as we mentioned, Iranian and Russian weapon exported to the hot points in the world it can be very harmful, as it would fuel up conflicts, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa region.
Has the Russian-Iranian military cooperation shifted the calculus for European countries and especially for Eastern Europe concerning regional developments in the Middle East, and how this recent geopolitical shift of closeness to Iran and to Russia affected those countries and the way they viewed the relationships with them?
It didn't affect Eastern Europe immediately and directly, but by the from the long-term perspective. First, we're afraid of Iranian-Russian alliance, because at the moment there is only deep military cooperation, not alliance per se. But Iranian, we before war we almost forgot about Iran. Iran was still is an object of sanctions, with internal crisis and almost perpetual economical crisis, but nothing more. Its involvement in the Ukraine by the side of Russia reminded us that the Middle East is very close to the Europe and very complicated area with very complicated political agenda. And Iranian support to Russia is not a danger for the Eastern European countries per se, but the more danger is that it gives Russia an upper hand in the term of extending its influence over the Middle East and over the Middle Eastern oil policy. Close relations between Moscow and Tehran and between Moscow and Riyadh are posing danger of increasing fuel prices, as all of those countries are interested in increasing prices of oil, and two of them, Russia and Iran, are subject of international sanctions. So those two are forced to sell its oil with a significant discounts. It is not comfortable situation for them, and Tehran and Moscow are trying to cope, to deal with those sanctions. And every success in their fight against sanctions is a defeat for us, and a huge blow for our wallets, as the prices in petrol gas stations are getting higher and higher.
Interestingly enough, Russia and Iran have also been exercising independently of each other various types of political influence. Russia with various, extreme parties, political parties in Europe. Iran mostly not so much political parties, although some political parties indirectly through lobbyists, but also migrant communities and certain political class. Now that these two countries are coming together, Russia's been widely condemned for its war crimes in Ukraine. Iran has engendered a great deal of rather short-lived outrage over the women's rights issues and the protests and so forth. But now that these two countries that have independently caused a lot of consternation are growing closer, there is also some level of political either clash or interdependence of interest that can happen even in Europe between the groups that their spheres of influence. How do you see that developing? Do you see them do you see their groups eventually coming to realization that they're being duped and played? For instance, the Russia influence groups, extreme right-wing groups are generally anti-Islamist and vice versa? Or do you see them essentially continuing to ignore these political contradictions and actually growing closer together?
More the second option, because we have to remember that the policy process is a process without beginning and without clear end. It's an evolution of and constant change, and of course a subject of propaganda and subject of new influences. Russia, regardless the result of the war, will try to keep or to extend its sphere of influence. The same case is Iran, and although Russia is able to hold its position among the mostly extremist groups in Europe, Iran is also able to hold its position among so-called resistance or anti-colonial, as they say it, groups in the Middle East. And it will not be affected by the reapproachment towards Saudi Arabia in the case of Iran, or by the result of war in Ukraine, especially that it seems the war will take some more time.
We're seeing also the growing closeness between these countries and also China on cybersecurity issues and also assorted forms of propaganda and political discourse. There's been a number of joint operations so far, mostly Russia and China together, Russia leading the way on these issues, but Iran also joining in on occasional attacks and information gathering scenarios. And all of the countries, but in particular Russia, are famous for their blackmail activities, political blackmail, using cyber to essentially cause problems. To what extent do you expect to see these sort of operations increase over time? Because we're seeing some signs of it elsewhere, nefarious actors using cyber warfare to generate political outrage, political campaign, and even impact policies as a result of this.
In the future, we will, for sure, we will witness increase in numbers and in importance of cyber warfare. And we have to cope with that. That it is another dimension, another area of conflict. And cybersecurity, considering cybersecurity, I consider cybersecurity as the most crucial area, as the whole network of interconnectivity depends on that. Controlling cyber dimension means controlling the reality, means controlling the media, controlling the news feeds, and currently in those days, controlling social media algorithms is almost as important as controlling and securing trade routes.
Given that Russia is now employing a growing number of proxies, allies, partners, whether in business or in economy or, political anti-Western, kind of trouble making, this particular area will become especially complicated if external third parties or third countries that are not necessarily directly involved in this become kind of employed as proxies or as allies in cyber operations and cyber activities. What can be done to keep these allies from getting more and more involved with China, Iran, and Russia as they ramp up their security activity and cyber activities? We're talking about the very same Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states or African states for that matter, and anyone else with any growing cyber capabilities.
And the first of all, we have to keep technology. We have to keep know-how in our hands, and especially the 5G and internet network. And we have to remember that at the moment we are dealing with kind of new Cold War. This time not between the USSR and United States, but between the West, means European Union, and United States from one side, and Russia and China another one. And we have to be focused on the cybersecurity and on the chain of supply of microchips and another hardware equipment. It has to be it has to be done by us, for us. And by that, and because of that, we have to be focused on production of components, not in China, but in, let's say, more friendly and less competitive countries.
One area where I've seen a somewhat surprising parallel to the original Cold War with somewhat different results is the area of food security. The war in Ukraine sparked a huge backlash in terms of the way especially developing countries have been affected. And while China has been making huge investments into infrastructure around the world with mixed results, I would say, Russia, China, and Iran have not been able to kind of compensate for the impact of food security. And this is where the West has a huge opening with these anti-colonialist developing countries that have been particularly vulnerable to this economic impact. But at the same time, the West is facing its own economic problems with inflation, with energy crisis, and so forth. So how can this situation be managed in a way that helps these countries dealing with their own economic problems, yet also kind of limit the engagement and the impact of foreign propaganda and these active measures by, relevant economic policy?
That's very problematic because until very recently, we lived in a world shaped by unipolar policy, the world where the Cold War was only historical definition, and nothing. And we thought that nothing like this could happen in our times. And the world, the whole world, especially chain of supplies, production system, etc., was designed for circumstances where the peaceful cooperation is an only option. We've thought that the Fukuyama's end of history in the global economy will last long. First, the COVID-19 outbreak, then war in Ukraine changed our perspective, and now we have to do follow up. We have to change everything. We have to change the chain of supplies. We can't threat Russia and China as friendly or at least neutral powers to ready to deal with us, regardless the policy. Now the economy and policy making is tied together more than it used to be before. And that's a challenge for especially smaller, weaker, and developing countries, because usually such countries are victims of change. Few of them can even go bankruptcy, because they rely on the old system, which is which is unusable at the moment.
We are seeing actually some of its impact even neighboring and friendly countries. Poland and Ukraine have had a dispute over grain. I wouldn't say dispute, but economic measures to prevent the flooding of Polish markets with the Ukrainian grain. How can this issue be handled in a way that does not help Russia exploit the situation?
That's another very important question, because there is of course the issue of war and our help and aid toward Ukraine. But except for the battlefield, there is also an issue of day-to-day life far away from the front line. And Russia is very active, not only in the military and propaganda field, but it is actively trying to throw a sand into our greens. And unfortunately, as Poland and Ukraine are countries with a long shared history, we are sharing also major problems. And as the war came quite sudden to us, we weren't fully prepared for new reality. And kind of Green Deal is one of the best examples for that. In the nearest future, it will be a huge challenge, but I'm sure we will be able to cope with that. Although I have to admit, I don't know how.
Well, you're bringing up a very important point here because one of the issues that I see in terms of US coverage, not just in the media, but in the political circuit, there is no solid understanding of the economic issues facing Europe, aside from the much beleaguered energy crisis that's become kind of a political rallying point here. But from the point of view of grain and agriculture and issues that are not, strictly speaking, political, they're just, regular economic issues, this sort of thing and these impacts of the war, they are not being really communicated effectively to the decision makers as well as to the media and policy circles here. And so there is an inaccurate understanding of what's happening. There is an underestimation of the economic impact outside Ukraine on the region. There's been commentary from the politicians saying, well, let's forget humanitarian aid, just focus on the military, let them win the war. And I understand the sentiment, and certainly I think US could be doing a lot more to bring this to an end a lot faster, and frankly, this shouldn't have happened at all to begin with. But given that the reality is what it is, the humanitarian and economic impact has been significant, and I don't think you can easily avoid facing those questions, or at least understanding what Europe is facing as a result. So I'm just wondering, how is it that these economic aspects are kind of seem to get lost in translation, but because it seems most of the discussion is focused exclusively on the military impact and not so much on anything else.
It is true. Unfortunately, the issue of economy is overshadowed by the policy and military issues. And just making long story short, there are two problems we are facing here in Europe, especially eastern part of it. First of all, increasing prices. That's as simple as that. We have many countries. I mean, all countries in the eastern part of Europe are facing bigger or smaller inflation. And second, we have problems with chain of supply. Many of components used to product goods in our factories were imported from the West, from Ukraine and from Russia. Russian market was also one of the biggest receiver of Eastern European export. Now the Russian market is closed. It's closed for the import and for the export. It means that we have to deal with scarcity of resources. Of course, it's not dramatic because fortunately, globalization made us able to rely on other supply roads, but still, it was a huge blow, huge and sudden blow to our economy. We had to find another supply of gas and another supply of raw materials. And it once again contributed to increase of the prices in all markets. Yeah, industrial, food, agricultural, everything went up.
That brings me to another point, which is, many different countries have been reacting to Russia's threats by purchasing more weapons, trying to join NATO, European Union, or both, or increase their relationships with those countries, which is all very positive, as far as I see it. But the one issue that is far more likely than Russia's, which is already stretched thin militarily, engaging in other invasions, is economic warfare, where unfortunately Russia does have a lot of room to maneuver between sanctions, circumvention, a new SWIFT system, alliances with Iran, China, and so forth, and just kind of maneuvering these vulnerabilities and playing them up politically with certain segments of the population to bring different political outcomes in the future. And this economic warfare prospect, I don't think there's any real discussion of how that could play out in Europe, especially, or anywhere else for that matter. Is there a concern about this economic interference in the markets, weaponization of these issues by Russia and its allies?
Oh, definitely. Russia, although the sanctions was a severe blow for its economy, is still a strong, not to say powerful country with a lot of cards in its hand. And Russia, as you said, can weaponize and is weaponizing its economy. First, they have upper hand in OPEC cartel, so they are able to maybe not control the oil prices, but they are able to influence the oil prices. They are also a huge reservoir of food products, including grain, which is substantial, a substantial part of its export. And not only it's just important not only because of the revenue from export, but because it's also a tool of influence over smaller countries, especially in Africa and the Middle East. And indirectly, Europe is also affected by that. Many Russian companies now became deadly competitors for Eastern European companies in local and regional markets. The economical warfare is almost as important as traditional kinetic military issue. And altogether with cyber warfare, it create a warfare triangle. We are involved and we are entangled too. And that's why it's very important to provide a clear information policy and to provide economical shield for not only for smaller developing countries in the region to exclude them from the Russian sphere of influence, but also within European societies, especially that many Eastern European countries were still suffering due to the post-COVID economical crisis. And current crisis, current inflation is making the situation worse. But at the moment, the situation is under control.
What do you think needs to be done to kind of create a stronger front against a coalition. There's been a pretty serious reconsideration of Russia as such. There's also been some, growing concerns about China, but seeing these countries as a coalition rather than individual countries causing problems, that's something that still hasn't been really dealt with, because when three or more countries connect in concert to engage in policies, operations, security agreements, and arrangements, that means their influence collectively becomes integrated and more far-reaching than each country just doing their thing and happening to agree with the others.
That's true, but luckily for us, the West, those countries, especially we're talking about Russia, China, and Iran, were not able to form alliance. They are cooperating, but there is only a limited geopolitical cooperation, not alliance. There is too high level of distrust between those countries to form a kind of effective alliance. We have to remember that except of potential for cooperation, there is also potential for a conflict between China and Russia. Those two countries are, to be honest, geopolitical competitors. At the moment, their conflicts are put aside because they are challenging United States and Western dominance. A similar issue is in the case of Russia and Iran. Those countries are not friends by any means. They are forced to cooperate due to external pressure from the side of the United States and the West. But except few issues, as for example the North-South corridor and the support from Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Russia and Iran share no common interest, and until quite recently, until the last decade, they were strong competitors in the Caucasus and Caspian Sea area. At the moment, they are cooperating. That's true. Their cooperation is getting deeper and wider. But still, it's not alliance. It's not a friendship. It's just to be honest, forceful cooperation.
Given these issues of distrust and differences in different long-term agendas, it would make sense to exploit them and to cause disruptions all the way up to the policy level, exacerbate distrust, cause issues between these countries. And yet I don't really see the Western world really treat them as such. And on the contrary, I see a very reactionary response to all this development. It's as if the whole world is caught by surprise that this is occurring, whereas I'm fairly sure that intelligence agencies and even political operatives have fair degree of understanding about the degree of communications between all these parties. So where is this disconnect between the level of information we are privy to and the very belated and weak and basically very confused, disoriented response to these maneuvers?
Well, the Middle East is a very complicated area, so it's very hard not only to predict the future development, but even to be up to date with the current one. And Iran is a very particular case and very complicated complicated case. It's a country which is positioning itself as a crucial part of so-called axis of resistance against Western or to be more precise, United States imperialism, as they call it. So it is very hard to buy out Iran from Russia, Russia sphere, because Iran is trying to keep full independence. But due to crisis, Iran was forced to rely on China, on China in the terms of economy, and on the Russia in the terms of policy and technology. We, the West, we're unable to offer something substantial to Iran to make it further from Russia. Unfortunately, and that's the part of the new Cold War. Iran is not Iran will not give up anything for free, and everything is the matter of the price we are able to offer to Iran.
Well, as a political matter of offering incentives, yes, you're right. There are limits to what we can do. But as a matter of exacerbating distrust between Iran, China, and Russia, that is something that does not rely on us having to give anything away or trying to lure them by positive incentives. It's a matter of literally exploiting underlying weaknesses against each other and causing rifts and playing fairly predictable games that where our agencies and others are well versed in. So the question is, why are we seeing only low level and not really high level penetration into these systems? Why is it that Iranian operatives are able to penetrate Western societies with relative ease and wreak havoc, import even uranium into Heathrow Airport, and we are unable to figure out how the Chinese and Iranian security services what their point of distrust is, and kind of create sort of
Luckily for us, the level of distrust between those countries are very high, especially in the case of Iran. As the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was based inter alia on independency. At that time, Iranian society perceived Iranian monarchy as a puppet of United States government, which, to be honest, was quite true.
I'd say British before American.
Yeah, that's true, and British all together with Russians, to be more precise, and that's why Iranians are really committed to the issue of independency, full independence, not only formal but full independency of Islamic Republic, political independency, economical, military, any kind of any kind. Iranian politicians wants to play a role of a superpower, at least regional superpower, regional hegemon, regional dominant force. And that's why, for example, they are perceiving the Chinese influence in the region not only as a chance to attract some investments, to do some business, to sell oil, but also as a threat, because with money, China will bring political influence. At the moment, as I said, the Iranian economy is dependent on Chinese refineries. As long as Chinese companies are buying Iranian oil, Iranian economy will survive. But in case of any, let's say, political problems between those two countries, and shift of Beijing toward Riyadh, it would cause a serious problem for Iran. So they are trying, at the same time, Iranians are trying to attract Chinese investors, attract Chinese money, attract Chinese buyers, but at the very same time, they are trying to keep them as far as possible from the infrastructure, from the production facilities, etc., etc.
It would be a shame if something happened to those refineries, but I don't think it's necessary for the foreigners to intervene for that to happen. Iran has plenty of its own internal actors who would be all too happy to make sure that that all does not
Definitely.
go smoothly. That said, that brings me to the last point, which is I am very confused by the Western position on the Iranian opposition, given what you just said about the monarchy being perceived as British and Russian and American puppets, which is this push for Reza Pahlavi in the public media as some symbol of resistance, because there seems to be a perception that being anti-regime in Iran necessarily means being pro-American. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. Someone could be pro-regime, against regime, but also not necessarily interested in somebody who grew up in the US and has not really been in Iran. And this
Definitely.
separation of perceptions, to me, this very open push of the opposition, in the West, and conflation with the 80 million Iranians, and whatever they may think of it, that to me seems a very counterproductive tactic on behalf of
It is.
Westerners looking to weaken the regime. In my opinion, they should be identifying native opposition that's, even if they're looking for a monarchy, there have been monarchies that were native to the region and not British or Russian or whoever imposed. So I'm curious as to how it came about that there is this obsession with something that's guaranteed to not work.
The issue of Iranian opposition and Iranian diaspora is very complicated. In many cases, Iranian opposition in abroad is very influential, but only abroad. There is no influence over local opposition. First of all, there is no organized opposition in Iran. To be honest, it's a part of Islamic Republic policy to keep it that way. But anyway, there is no organized opposition inside of Iran. And as you mentioned, there is a possibility to be anti-regime, anti-Islamic Republic, and anti-American, anti-US at this, or so-called anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist at the same time. In many cases, support of opposition abroad to opposition figure in Iran is a kiss of death. Opposition outside Iran has no influence over protesters, over unorganized opposition in the country. Most Iranians seeing those opposition figures with Crown Prince Pahlavi as puppets, and the very idea of restoring monarchy in Iran is how to say, let's say, not too serious.
There is a great deal of money to be made in that concept here, however, so I'm sure it will remain popular for as long as as there is support. Well, thank you so much for your insights on the subject. There is so much more to be said, but unfortunately, the time has come to an end. But it does raise many important questions, which I hope our audience will examine further, as they're not really being addressed where they should be, which is in major policy think tanks, administrations, parliaments and congresses, and the media. They're being bypassed or overlooked, or maybe deliberately. So because these questions are quite uncomfortable in many
Oh yes,
in many subjects, but that's where I come in. I like to say out loud what nobody wants wants to. So but I also hope that as a result of such discussions, we can increase the level of more open discussions, more cooperation on issues that are being overshadowed, forgotten, or just not really we're not used to managing jointly. I think there is much more room for cooperation, for strengthening relations in a positive way, and more exchanges of both ideas and economic cooperation as well. And I hope that's something that will that as a result of these difficult situations, that will lead to something positive in those areas.
Hope so. Let's hope so.
Thank you so much. And for those watching us, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. We'll be back again next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.